Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to welcome distinguished guests, our trustees, colleagues, faculty, staff, and students, and friends. You know, a year ago, we inaugurated the Eugene H. Fram Chair in Applied Critical Thinking with a lecture by Dr. N. Catherine Hales, an RIT alumnus and a renowned cultural critic, who's also a distinguished professor at Duke University. And this afternoon, we continue this august annual tradition, coinciding with the start of our academic year, with a very special guest, Professor Richard Arum of New York University, one of the world's leading sociologists of education. And I'm really delighted that he has accepted our invitation to give this year's Fram lecture. His sobering and provocative research, summarized in his 2011 book, Academically Adrift, sent a shockwave throughout much of the educational establishment. Academic administrators, social policy experts, politicians, educators, and the general public could only avoid his conclusions at their own peril. This sparked a healthy and important debate about the core mission of higher education, with its call for a renewed emphasis on writing, complex reasoning, and critical thinking. And I might add that recent announcements by the current administration about a possible measuring stick for higher education is notably lacking in reference to those skills, and I think that's a source of concern for all of us. Fostering such essential lifelong skills, and I might add the related dispositional values, is precisely the reason why the Fram Chair in Applied Critical Thinking was established by an anonymous RIT alumnus in honor of his former teacher. So I'd like to take a moment to recognize Gene Fram, the J. Warren McClure Professor Emeritus of Marketing at the Saunders College of Business, who served on our faculty for a remarkable 51 years. Gene, where are you? Stand up and be recognized. Now, numerous studies have demonstrated that critical thinking is a key competency that employers want and expect from our graduates. I also believe that critical thinking is necessary and vital for a truly democratic society to exist and to flourish, something I emphasized in a recent Huffington Post article I read. Ultimately, we desire for our students to become actively engaged global citizens. In a deeper and more profound sense, critical thinking can help them to understand themselves and their place in the world. RIT stands only to lead in this area, to become a model for other institutions and to work tirelessly to make this a priority. Now, it's a remarkable coincidence that Fram, get this, Gene, you'll love this, is also the name chosen by the great Norwegian polar explorer, scientist, statesman, and Nobel laureate Fridtjof Nansen for his humble wooden ship, which he used in his epic quest for the North Pole between 1893 and 1896. Fram is the Norwegian word meaning to advance, progress, or to move forward. In other words, not to be adrift, but to get back on course, to steadfastly press ahead, and even under pressure, uncertainty, and against all odds, to achieve one's goal. So Fram's a great, great title for this whole program. This past year has been a very busy and exciting time for Professor Clarence B. Sheffield, Jr., the initial occupant of the Fram Chair, and I might add, unlike myself, a fluent speaker of Norwegian. And that stuff I just told you, he told me. He has conducted faculty workshops, sponsored programming, networked with national leaders, and engaged in community outreach, in addition to meeting with his advisory group consisting of faculty from all of our colleges, as well as colleagues in academic affairs. He has worked hard to establish the necessary foundation and to set the proper course for this chair, while acknowledging, of course, that there is much work to be done. Please join me in welcoming Chip, who will introduce Professor Arum. Chip?
Thanks very much, President Destler. Richard Arum is arguably one of the country's foremost sociologists of education. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology with a joint appointment in the Steinhardt School of Education and director of the Institute for Human Development and Social Change at New York University. Since 2005, he's also directed the educational research program at the Social Science Research Council in New York City, an independent, international, nonprofit organization established in 1923, which fosters innovative, interdisciplinary research in the social sciences. He earned his BA in political science from Tufts University, magna cum laude, his M.Ed in teaching and curriculum from the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University, and his PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include education, the legal and institutional environments of schools, student achievement and socialization, and more recently, the sociology of self-employment. He is currently in the final year of a 3-year, $3,256,000 grant from the MacArthur Foundation that explores, quote, digital media, education, and youth. And yes, that's the same MacArthur Foundation which announced its MacArthur Genius Awards yesterday. He's the recipient of numerous grants from some of the most prestigious institutions in higher education, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Lumina Foundation, the Teagle Foundation, National Science Foundation, and the Kauffman Foundation, to name only a few. A prolific writer, reviewer, media commentator, advisor to local, state, and federal governments, institutional, corporate, and legislative bodies, as well as an exceptional mentor to his students. He is first and foremost an exceptional, award-winning teacher and a protean intellect. I think that it is safe to say that his gritty experiences as a public high school teacher in Oakland, California, from 1986 to 1993, made a lasting impression, and that they provided the magic spark to his subsequent brilliant career. In other words, he speaks from personal experience and a deep understanding of the complexities and the myriad challenges facing higher education. 2 faculty respondents will follow Professor Arum. They are Dr. Elizabeth Hain, an associate professor in the Gosnell School of Life Sciences in our College of Science, who earned her PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Brown University, and who incidentally also serves as the Provost Faculty Associate for General Education. She will be followed by Dr. Michael Laver, the Associate Professor of History in the College of Liberal Arts, who earned his PhD in East Asian Languages and Civilization at the University of Pennsylvania. And he also is presently the chair of our RIT Faculty Senate. Professor Arum, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for taking time today to come out and hear me address this topic. And I'll start off by letting you know what I'm going to be speaking about today. These are, pardon me if you will, I can't get away from being an educator. These are my learning objectives for today's class. And I wanted to start with the first question. What is critical thinking? How do maybe that's so obvious I don't need to say anything about it, but it's not obvious to me. And so what is critical thinking? Why is it important enough that we should fill this room to think about it? And then also a real challenge: how would one go about measuring it, assuming that such a thing indeed existed? Next, I'm going to cover what the state of undergraduate education looks like, and how we might see critical thinking developing or not on a typical college campus today. And then finally, I'm going to share with you some findings of a recent cohort that graduated in 2009, how they're faring in today's labor market and in other domains of adult life, and the extent to which that ties back to skills like critical thinking. Now, most of the work will come from this book that was published in 2011, but in addition, I will update it with additional work. This ended with students 2 years through college. We subsequently followed students through all 4 years of college and into the labor market, so I'll update the findings as well. Now, let me start by trying to tell you what I mean by critical thinking. For me, critical thinking is the ability to examine things that are put in front of you and not take them at face value, but rather to subject that information to critical reflection. Not all information that's put in front of us is reliable. It's not all valid. It isn't always logically consistent and coherent. And so one of the things we hope to do in higher education is to teach people the capacity to cross-examine information that's put in front of them. And this is a critically important skill for individuals, not just in their academic work, but arguably in their economic endeavors and also in their political endeavors. So today, there's no shortage of information available on every topic imaginable on the internet. The trouble is, a lot of that information is largely garbage. Or, maybe a more polite way to say it is, it's rhetoric, political rhetoric. And so critical thinking is the ability to see through rhetoric on either side of the debate and think about the information in front of you. And then once you've done that, you can attempt to make sense of it. Now, why I think, for me, critical thinking is part of a larger set of higher order skills, a higher order set of competencies. And so in the work I'm going to show you shortly, it is assessed at the same time that complex reasoning and written communication is also assessed. So it's not there's not an attempt to isolate it from these other higher order skills, but again, to embed the assessment, the measurement of it, with these other skills such as complex reasoning, taking information from multiple sources and making sense of it, synthesizing it, making logical arguments from it, and communicating to others about it. So these, I think, are best assessed together. And you'll see, again, in this study here, that's exactly how we go about it. I'll say a little bit more about the measurement shortly. Now, let me say one other thing about kind of why I think it is so important today. Today, we increasingly live in an economic system that's incredibly dynamic. And so if we're preparing students in classes today for a specific occupation, a specific field, we all know, or should know, that that occupation might not exist 10 years from now. The idea that we would place an individual in a job right out of college and they would be in that job for the rest of their lives is fallacious. We know from the data that people increasingly move from job to job, occupation to occupation, industry to industry. And so what does training then look like in higher education? Doesn't mean that occupationally relevant skills aren't important. Of course they are. But also these generic skills, these general higher order skills that are transferable from job to job and to other domains other than the labor force are critically important. They are the ones that help an individual navigate through their adult life. Occupationally specific skills are often learned well in college, but they're also can be learned on the job through firm-specific training. And so colleges and universities have to do more than just that. They have to to attempt to arm the students with these generic higher order competencies. Now, to get at this work, what we did was we had to piece together our own data set. And the data set, it was large scale. It involved following large numbers of students in a set of more than 24 diverse colleges and universities, and following them over time, where they were given an assessment when they started college, an assessment after 2 years, an assessment after 4 years, and then again, like I said, we followed them into the labor market. But we didn't just give them an assessment. We also collected their transcripts to take a look at what coursework they were taking. And in addition, we surveyed them at the end of 2 and 4 years to ask them what their academic experiences were like. If we had nothing but a simple assessment, a simple test measure, and I showed you results on that, we would know very little about what the character of higher education is. The strength of this work, I think, is the extent to which we ask students what they are experiencing in college, and we see the extent to which those academic experiences, classes, majors, and so on, track with development on this assessment. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this measurement piece. How do you measure critical thinking or higher order skills or writing? So we use one instrument out there. I think it's a state-of-the-art instrument. It was developed by psychometricians at Stanford and Rand after many years. And what it attempts to do is measure holistically, in an authentic way, whether students can apply this knowledge, apply these skills, this program that I've been asked to speak on here. It's applied critical thinking, right? Not just critical thinking in general, but can you use these competencies to apply and apply them to a real-world problem? And so students are given a task that they might be given as an employee working for a firm after college. They're given a set of documents, and they're asked to do something with it. And I'll show you an example of it shortly. It's a direct measure, and I say it's a direct measure because most of the research that higher education has been drawn on before my work has been based on self-reported learning. They ask students when they finish college, how much do you think you learned when you were at college? Well, our American cultural trait is very clear. They all say they've learned a lot. More than 90% of students say they learned a lot in college. If I asked the question here of this audience, how many of you are better than average drivers? Again, you get 90% of hands go up. We're not very good at assessing our own skills. But worse than that, these self-reported measures that came before ours were given at the same time where they asked students, how socially engaged were you in college campus? And the students that said, I'm in clubs, I'm in a fraternity, I'm in a sorority, I'm active, I study with my friends, were also the same kids that said, I learned a heck of a lot at college. Because they're extroverted. They're very confident in themselves and socially and academically. The problem with that is, well, one, empirically, it turns out not to be true. Social engagement well, I'll show you shortly, doesn't track with learning at all in a positive direction, slightly negative, in fact. The second problem is much more serious. Because of that research, higher education institutions increasingly invested and devoted resources to student social engagement on campus, to increasing the number of clubs, to encouraging students to study in groups, and so on. This is a great strategy for keeping kids in school. Great strategy for addressing retention problems. It is a terrible strategy if you think it's going to produce positive learning outcomes. So we don't use that. We use a direct measure of assessment. It's like every measure, direct measure, it's limited, it's imperfect, it's flawed. That's true of any assessment measure, but it's a rough proxy for some of the things we're trying to capture. And I should say it's also kind of a widely used instrument out there in the voluntary system of accountability that many colleges and universities are using. It's also was the basis of the OECD has just piloted a project called AHELO, the Assessment for Higher Education Learning Outcomes project, where they measured learning in multiple countries in engineering, economics, and then a generic strand. And for the generic strand, they used a modified version of the CLA. And so just the way in the past you've seen PISA and TIM studies of math and science performance in K-12 education, we're now beginning to see that internationally in higher education. Whether we like it or not, the assessments, the technology is such that increasingly that's becoming possible and people indeed are doing it. So let me give you a real example of this assessment and then we'll get on to the actual findings. So the test is a computer. It's all in front of a computer. Students are set in front of a computer and they're given a task to do. And the task looks something like this. This is an example. Imagine you work for a company and the company is planning to buy a small plane for sales and marketing team, for its sales and marketing team. Right before the purchase goes through, a similar model, the plane crashes. And your boss comes to you and says, what should we do? Should we go ahead with this purchase or not? And you're given a set of documents to consider. You're given a report from the Federal Aviation, the FAA. You're given newspaper reports on the accident. You're given scientific journal articles about the engineering of the plane. You're given email correspondence between your boss and the person trying to sell them the plane, right? Not all that information is the same, right? You have to take the reliability and validity, consider it differently, right? The email correspondences between the guy trying to sell your company the plane, you have to take with a grain of salt, right? You have to think critically about the information, synthesize information across these documents, write a logical argument based on that information. Not a simple task, not a simple task at all, but exactly the kind of task you'd expect college students to be able to do and do better the longer they were in college and university. There's more information on this test. It's developed by the Council for Aid to Education, the grading rubric, how these things are graded at the bottom there. So let's go to the results. Like I said, we assess students beginning and the end, and we survey them. Let's start with the surveys of what we saw when we asked college students in America in a fairly representative sample of colleges and universities, what they did in a typical semester. And this semester would be the fall of their sophomore year, but it turns out it's a fairly representative year. Students don't write more when they're seniors. It's a fairly representative in terms of writing, reading, homework, and so on. And so we asked the naive social science question in the study: how many courses did you take where you wrote more than 20 pages of writing over the course of the semester? How many courses? Because we were naive social scientists that assumed that students were doing this a lot. The data came back so skewed to zero. We just used this dichotomy here. Did you have any course where you were asked to write 20 or more pages over the course of the semester? And this is the really frightening part. 50% of the students say no classes where I was asked to write more than 20 pages. 50% full-time college students in America today. Similar question, maybe a slightly lower bar. How many classes do you take where on average you read more than 40 pages per week? Right? 32% say, I don't have any class where I've been asked to read more than 40 pages per week on average. Something is amiss, right? There's something, obviously some programs you might not do the reading, some programs you might, but when you get numbers like this, they really suggest that something fundamentally is amiss. And that our concern was really magnified when we went to the time use data. Because we asked students, what are you doing with your time? And the students told us that, and this is other data sets like NESI, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a time diary on this that's even much worse, much lower numbers of hours of academic engagement. But full-time college students say that they're in class 15 hours a week if they go to all their classes and labs and so on. That's 15 hours. We won't get into the attendance issue, which unfortunately when I teach at my big lecture at NYU is that, not all students show up. But let's give them the benefit that they all show up 15 hours a week. How many hours studying? 12 to 13 hours a week. And a third of that, they say they're studying with their friends, which we'll show you later, not positively associated with growth in, negative. The more you spend with your friends, negative. And so studying alone, traditional studying alone, 8 hours per week. 8 hours per week. And alone today is a little, is different because, excuse me, I have to answer my text message and check my Facebook and, what is an hour alone today? But a full-time college student, 8 hours. And so, but let's do the compared to what? Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's a reasonable amount. Well, 28. Let's give them the benefit. Let's include the hours studying with friends, even though it's not particularly useful academically. Because it's unstructured, it's not structured group work, it's just hanging out. But 28 hours. Students are in high school 35 hours a week in their seats. Plus, high schools actually have become harder over the last few decades. So many students are studying 3 to 4 hours a night. My kids are at home. So they come to college and they were 35 hours in their seat plus homework on time, and then they get this. 28 hours. And they'll say, when you interview them, we thought college was going to be harder than high school, but it's not. It's easier. But as any sociologist or anthropologist will tell you, human beings are quick to adapt to their environments. So okay, I thought it was this, but it's that. Okay, I can do 28 hours a week. I can fill up my time and with all these other things. And so college and university, the typical full-time college student today, although it's full-time means something different than what you might think. And it means something different than it did just a few decades ago. And so this work is from two labor economists, the late Philip Babcock from UC Santa Barbara and Mindy Marks. And they went back and looked at every survey, national survey, where students were asked how many hours they studied, full-time college students. From 1920 to 1960, the data is not national, it's specific colleges, but it's about, their academic time is about 35 to 40 hours a week, including their class time, 25 hours studying. Then from 1960 on, something happens where the average hours that a student studies drops in half. It drops from 25 to 12. So again, it's not like this in high school. It's not like it hasn't always been like this in college. And one more comparison that might be illustrative here, it's not like that everywhere. American higher ed, like America generally, is exceptional. We charge twice as much for college than in Europe. It's a different model. It's residential, and there's all sorts of amenities that come with it. And we compete for students with more and more amenities. So it's twice what it costs in Europe. But the amount of academic effort that people put in is significantly less than every country in Europe with the exception of the Slovak Republic. So here we have Italy, Germany, Spain, Ireland, the Netherlands, France, and so on. And so the bottom here is 25, so I don't want to be misleading you with the slope here. Again, combined academic time for America for 28 hours, and in most countries in Europe, it's closer to 35. One other thing about this studying. So remember, we had the transcripts, the student transcripts. So we thought, okay, you're studying, average student studying an hour, a little more than an hour a day, 8 hours studying alone. 36% of the sample said they were studying 5 or fewer hours alone per week, less than an hour a day. We picked up their transcripts saying, okay, these kids are really just going to be struggling to get by. Nope. Their transcript grades were 3.25, closer to a B plus than a B. You don't need to spend hours and hours studying to do well in college campus day. Remember the last slide, or a couple ones back? You don't have to take courses with reading. You don't have to take courses with writing. You don't have to take courses that are particularly hard. You can use the social media out there to navigate your way through college and do very little. But, of course, if you assess an outcome over time, what are you going to get? Well, you're not going to get much growth. And you're not going to get much growth because how in the world is someone going to move significantly up on a test that isn't just a test of basic knowledge that requires simple regurgitation, but one that measures a higher order skill, competency? How are you going to see growth there when the treatment is so weak? It's less than an hour a day for large numbers of students, 36%, remember? And so when we looked at the gains in the CLA score, after 2 years, 45% didn't move up. If the test was scaled from 0 to 100, 45% of the students didn't move up even a point. And over 4 years, 36% of them didn't move up over a point. And so, again, why would they? This is an assessment that, again, critical thinking, complex reasoning, writing is all together. It's all integrated as one whole. But if you use a different measure, there's a multiple choice measure out there that the folks in the Wabash liberal arts study have used. They find the same finding as us. They just look at critical thinking and complex reasoning, multiple choice test, no writing. But if they get basically the same thing, if you're looking at any of these general generic skills, this is the picture you're going to get: limited moderate growth on this indicator. It's about a half a standard deviation. The results back a few decades ago, using different measures but getting at the same task, was a full standard deviation. So I think it's a fair estimate to say the demonstrated growth in higher ed today on these generic skills is about half of what it was a few decades ago. Remember, the amount of hours studying is about a half. So the empirical patterns line up in a way that's suggestive that, again, that there's a serious problem going on here. Now, for educators, it's a question, okay, but what can we do about it? What matters? Well, our study highlights a few things that do matter. First of all, like every K-12 educator knows, professors don't always know this because they're not trained to teach, they're trained to do research. But expectations matter. If you have high expectations for your students, and the professor from marketing with 52 years, 51 years of experience, 51, from all reports demonstrated that every day in his class, high expectations, the students will rise to meet the expectations. And so the question we ask is, do your faculty have high expectations for students like you? Students like you, conjuring up group affiliation, whether whatever that may be. And so when faculty said yes, when students said yes, faculty said yes, students responded. when students had at least one course with that crude and vulgar measure of reading and crude and vulgar measure of writing, they learned more. Right? Imagine if we had even more fine-grained measures of did you get feedback on your writing? What was the type of your writing? Did you read technical, scientific? If we had better measures, we'd even have stronger results here. But even these crude measures in the CLA work just fine for demonstrating these trends. This I alluded to earlier. All these are, by the way, we estimate their scores going in at time 2, controlling for scores at time 1, controlling for prior SAT scores and individual background and so on. The more hours you spend studying alone, the more your score improves over time. The more hours you spend studying with peers, opposite. And it trends downward at the same rate as the hours you spend in a fraternity and a sorority. Students they're not randomly sorted into majors, and so take this, of course, with a grain of salt. But if you look at the broad patterns of where there's more and less learning in college and university, we find in the traditional arts and science core of the university, social science, humanities, and science and math, the highest rate of learning. And it's in that traditional core that you find in the social science and humanities, not surprisingly, more reading and writing. And in the science and math, not so much reading and writing, but the highest amount of hours studying anywhere in the college. And so though that academic rigor translates into growth on this indicator. One other important thing we find, you can do something with the data that's called partitioning the variance. How much of the change in higher ed is within the college and how much is across colleges, right? We had 24 plus colleges and universities. How much difference is between an RIT and a University of Rochester? How much is within University of Rochester or within an RIT? The answer is this: colleges matter. 23% of the variation in learning is across colleges. Colleges can make a difference. And some of it's around selectivity of entering students, but not all of it. Colleges and universities can make a difference by focusing their curriculum on developing these competencies. However, equally important, 77% of the variance is within the school. The majority of the variation in higher ed today is within each college. And so here at RIT, implication, there are pockets of excellence. There are pockets here where students are applying themselves, rigorous program, studying long hours, and learning. If you gave them something like the CLA, they would demonstrate great growth. But RIT, like every other college and university, even the best ones we looked at in our study, had pockets of despair, pockets where very little was happening in terms of academic rigor. And so we argue that we don't need accountability across institutions. We need cultures of assessment within colleges and universities to make sure that we have uniform excellence within the institutions. Now let me move quickly, I know I'm running out of time, to where the students are today. And this is a report we issued a year ago, descriptive findings on where the graduates were 2 years later. And we have a follow-up book that's coming out in the fall, next fall, that goes into this data in much greater detail. One, this is probably no surprise, this is in many of the headlines at this point, college debt, right? Large numbers of students are going through college and amassing significant debt. 2/3 of students approximately have debt, and if they do, they average around $27,000 of debt. There is 10% of our sample that has more than $50,000 of debt they're leaving college with. So they're highly indebted, and that is different from before, right? That is their college loans have been around a long time, but the amount of debt, the extent to which debt is financing higher education is new to this generation. Now, these students graduated in 2009 during a very difficult labor market. They were much better off than if they had not gone to college. Much better off than if they had not gone to college. But they faced high rates of unemployment and underemployment. So we see here that 7% of the sample was formerly unemployed. They didn't have a job and they were actively looking for work. And 16% of them were only could find part-time employment. More important, however, for the topic of this lecture is the role of critical thinking and complex reasoning and writing and helping one find a job. So if you compared the top quintile, the top 20% of our sample on that CLA scored when they ended college, to the bottom quintile, the bottom 20% scoring on the CLA test leaving, you had a 3 times difference in the likelihood of being unemployed. A 3% unemployment for people at the top, a 9% unemployment rate for people at the bottom. This also tracks not just with unemployment, and we'll show in the book coming out, students will actually report that they've lost a job is related to their CLA performance, right? So they get a job and the employer is dissatisfied, expecting someone with college-educated skills, and based on the CLA performance and apparently the job performance, they've lost a job even in the first 2 years. It also tracks with these other proxies, credit card debt, not as strongly as unemployment, but also living at home. If you're in the top quintile of the CLA score, you are half as likely to live at home than if you were in the bottom quintile. On average, 25% of the students 2 years out of college were back living at home with their parents. You know, a very high rate that really speaks to the difficulties they had making these transitions. One last empirical finding, and maybe the most troubling of all. We asked students after they graduated college about their civic engagement. We asked them, how often do you read the newspaper in print or online? In print or online. And this tracks weakly with the CLA, not as strongly, but the overall finding was 36% of the students graduates came back to us and said, we read the newspaper in print or online monthly or never. Monthly or never, right? This is the educated citizens of the future that are going to be responsible for seeing through the rhetoric, wrestling with the complex issues of our time, and making informed electoral decisions. Right? Somehow they left college and university without understanding that this is a requirement of democratic citizenship. This is a requirement, a responsibility of being educated is to keep up with the news of the day and be able to make sense of it. We got similar results discussing politics and public affairs with friends, family, or coworkers. 39% said monthly or never. Okay. And you would think, since 25% of them were living back at home with their parents, and large numbers were unemployed or underemployed, you would think they'd have a lot to discuss. Okay, let me just have a little concluding slide where the implications. And so what do we do about this? What do we do about this problem? Well, first of all, let me start with what we shouldn't do, what would be the absolute wrong thing to do, and that is federally imposed accountability. Now, hey, I'm telling you, you're laughing, but if you're in Washington, what not everyone realizes in this room is higher ed is financed today by not just private student loans and families, it's financed by the federal government. The federal government, without that support, higher ed today would look completely different. It's through not just Pell Grants, but indirect research, indirect recovery on research grants, loans to parents that are guaranteed by the college. The federal government makes this possible. And when people in Washington see that just writing a check and trusting institutions to do to use that money wisely, not just to build a new student center, a new gym, a new dorm room. And I go to colleges and universities, I can't find any place I've gone that doesn't have at least one of those, if not all three. But the people, it's not, the gravy train is not going to last forever. And so if we don't take up this work ourselves, there will be federally imposed accountability, and it will be terrible. It will be counterproductive. It will be, lead to all sorts of unintended negative consequences, just like in K-12 education. So how do we take up this work ourselves? Well, there's a role for everyone. There's a role in everyone. For one, I'm totally grateful that the president and provost both are in the room. They are signaling symbolically that they care about this issue. And that is part of the problem, is that we need leadership in institutions to show symbolically and also substantively with resource allocations that that academic investments are at the core of the enterprise. Faculty have a responsibility as well, right? This is teaching ultimately is a faculty responsibility. And so we can't solve it individually as a faculty member. If I'm rigorous, have high standards, like our friend from marketing who taught for 51 years, but no one else in the marketing department does, you know where the students are going to go. They go out or they go to different majors. So collectively, the faculty has to come together and have that difficult conversation about what reasonable standards are and solve the problem collectively. And students also, of course, ultimately it's the students' responsibility, their own education. It's not just, they're not just victims in all this, right? It's their responsibility. But we have a responsibility to them to provide them with better information. Not for them to think less than an hour a day, they got a B+. How much they get the survey, how much do you think you learned? I learned a lot. The teachers told me I did, I got a B+. We have the responsibility to give them information. No, this is not a B+. This is not sufficient. We need to hold them accountable, at least with information so they can make informed decisions about what they're doing. They don't know that they're studying half of what students studied a couple of decades ago. They don't know that students were studying at higher rates in other countries. They do know they're studying less than in high school, if you ask them. And so, it's reforms like that we're all part of. The trustees also could have a role. The trustees are often, they hold the president and provost accountable for everything else, right? How are you measuring learning? Where are areas that need improvement? What are you doing to improve it? Having those questions at the forefront of the conversations trustees are having with university leadership would go a long way. If you have any further questions, we have a website and my email address. Thank you very much for your time.
It's not my computer. All right. So I want to thank Chip, for this opportunity. The last time I was asked to give any commentary after a visitor was here was Bill McKibben, and I got up and talked about maple syrup for 20 minutes. So I promise I won't do that this time. I think the book, Academically Adrift, does a great job of pointing out what the problem is. But the question in my mind is, what do we do about it? What's our responsibility next? And I think we need to address the problem at least two levels. We need to address it as faculty at the course and instructor level, and then also at the curricular level. So the book sort of just skims the surface of what we should need to do pedagogically to increase critical thinking in our classrooms. While we've just seen that there's a correlation between the number of pages of reading assigned each week and the performance on this critical thinking test, as a scientist, I feel like I need to point out that correlation is not causation. You can't just assign more reading and expect the students to learn more in the classrooms. So my question when I read that result was, what else is happening in that classroom? Yes, they're reading more, but they must be doing something else. There are things that we can do to increase critical thinking in the classroom. So things like case studies, interviews, projects, presentations. There's a whole new theory that's just getting started in using games to teach critical thinking in classrooms, that students can use games in their learning. There's a whole body of research on inquiry-based science and undergraduate research and the powerful transformation that can have for all different kinds of students. The work of George Koo on high-impact practices within higher education. So these are all things that I think faculty need to take responsibility for and make sure that those things are happening in their classrooms, but I also feel that they need to be incentivized. So as Dr. Arum just mentioned, the upper administration needs to recognize it when faculty utilize these tools in their classrooms, and it needs to become institutionalized. So this is actually on my door. And it says, if you can't read it at the bottom, it says, it's good to know about trees, but just remember, nobody ever made big money knowing things about trees. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a forest ecologist, so this is sort of near and dear to my heart, but it really comes around, it sort of brings up my second set of questions, which is that we really need to think about this balance between career preparation and sort of the more traditional aspects of a higher education. And I'd say it's not even really a balance. That sort of sets it up as a dichotomy. In my mind, it really is integration of those things. The book singles out students majoring in liberal arts and sciences as a little bit of a bright spot of a place in the curriculum where students seem to be doing better. But of course, it's possible to teach critical thinking within disciplines that are more career-focused. Clearly, we're here today because of the efforts of Eugene Fram, who taught critical thinking as part of his course in business. My sense is, however, that student skills would be most strengthened by a joint effort. So bringing together humanities and social sciences with science, engineering, computer science, and business courses so that students have a more seamless, integrated experience of critical thinking. And we do this at RIT to some degree already. We could do better, but we do it to some degree already. I'm an self-serving example from my own discipline of environmental science. The students do a senior capstone level experience where we send them out into the community of Rochester to solve environmental problems. So they've worked on things like, what do you do with waste grease from the French fries from Jefferson Avenue? What do you do with water quality declining in retention ponds in neighborhoods in Parenton? What do we do about natural versus human-created wetlands on campus? What's the water quality in those? And our students go out and look at those problems. But they don't look at them just from a scientific perspective, but they draw in what they've learned from liberal arts and social sciences and put it in a larger societal context. So I think that there are opportunities to do more things like this. I know there are other examples of programs around campus that are working on these kinds of things. We need to find a way for our students to see the liberal arts and sciences as something that's integral to their degree and not something to just sort of get out of the way as a requirement. I've been privileged in my job to spend a lot of time talking to faculty about general education on campus. I've seen literally hundreds and hundreds of course outlines that are part of our general education curriculum. I know there's some really exciting courses out there. What the course outlines don't tell me are the two things that I've been talking about, though. One is, what's the pedagogy? How is that content being delivered? And I think that falls in really the hands of the faculty who's teaching it. And the second one is, how does that course connect and integrate with other courses that are being offered at the institution? For that, I think faculty need to spend more time talking to each other. As part of my vetting of the Gen Ed framework, I had a conversation with Jeff Lasky in information technology about his course in data mining and its place in the curriculum. And he said to me, wouldn't my course be a much richer experience if the students came into that course with a strong background in statistics and a strong grounding in ethics? He said it would be so much more of a more interesting conversation about data mining. So these key questions, I think, are, and I think the answer to this question is really yes, we have to do both these things and we need to integrate them. You have assigned reading, right? So I set 40 pages a week. This isn't 40 pages, but after I was asked to do this, I feel like this topic just kept coming up everywhere. The top article is How to Get a Job with a Philosophy Degree, which is a really interesting article in the New York Times just last week about things that are happening at Wake Forest and the way that they're talking to their students about their general education requirements, which is, I think, really unusual and interesting. And then the Chronicler of Higher Education talking about, of course, employers and public favoring graduates who can actually communicate. So I'll leave you with one last thought, which is Calvin and Hobbes talking about the importance of critical thinking. The more you know, the harder it is to take decisive action. Once you become informed, you start seeing complexities and shades of gray. You realize that nothing is as clear and simple as it first appears. Ultimately, knowledge is paralyzing. So being a man of action, I can't afford to take that risk. And Hobbes says, well, you're ignorant, but at least you act on it. So I think we need to make sure that our students don't become like Calvin, right? So I hope that these are issues that we all can continue to work on together. I'll turn it over to Michael.
All right, I don't have any jokes or anything, and I wish I did. Okay, as I was rereading Richard's book, we happened in my Chinese history course to be talking about the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, and one of the key features of that Cultural Revolution was that students were taking their teachers out of the classroom and hanging placards on their necks calling them counter-revolutionaries and dunces and beating them and making them do self-confessions and you know, then killing them. And I don't think that your first chapter, which really highlights the shortcomings of faculty, had that image in mind, but that was the image I got. I just want to preface my remarks by saying that, that it makes for disturbing reading. And so what I want to do today is a little bit of introspection, self-criticism, if you will, both on a personal level, I mean, don't worry too much, and also at an institutional level. So I just highlighted a couple points here that I think bear at least thinking about. One of the things you hear when you hear about an RIT education, which is a great education, of course, is the RIT brand. And, you know, there are a lot of positives with the RIT brand, a lot of real positives. But I wonder to what extent there can be some unintended consequences of that as well. So, for example, in College of Liberal Arts. I can't speak for College of Science, but perhaps there also. One thing you hear a lot is that, RIT students come for a career-oriented education, and they're looking to get a job, and they're looking for, all of this stuff, and that's great because it drives them. But on the other hand, I wonder to what extent faculty, and I find myself doing this, to what extent faculty teach down to that. To what extent do faculty say, well, these students are so busy in engineering and chemistry and all these things, they don't have time to read. Students don't read. You hear that all the time. Students just won't read. You assign 100 pages a week, they won't read it. They'll gladly take a C on the quiz rather than do the reading. So to what extent are we complicit in that sort of narrative? It's just something I was, talking a little bit, thinking a little bit about last night. And then, to go further with that, Elizabeth touched on this a little bit, but, what kind of readings are we giving our students? So, for example, it's quite common in history courses to give a textbook, of introduction to East Asian history or something like that. And that's fine, and they're written by scholars, but they're generally neat, tidy narratives that take you through the chronology of East Asia, for example. Are we assigning readings, supplemental readings perhaps, that challenge the traditional narrative or dive deeper into the traditional narrative? And then are we examining those sources in class, not just having them to read those sources? The other trap I find myself falling into is students will treat me, and I suspect professors across the Institute, as repositories of knowledge. You go to the professor to get the answer. To what extent are we complicit in that model rather than challenging our students, instead of just giving them our opinion, or, do we let them know that this is just our opinion and what do you think? Again, I don't know. This is my own experience. I find myself falling into these traps a little bit. What kind of feedback are we giving on coursework? For example, is it enough just to require a series of papers and then a final paper at the end? I started resorting to electronic feedback. So I would, for example, make track changes and insert comments because, you leave your papers outside of your office and your students, they don't come get them. They're off for the winter holiday, they're off for summer. And then, 1 year later, you're dumping them all into the recycle bin, the single stream recycling bin. So, to what extent are we truly engaging with student work? Are we making sure that students get that feedback in some way? Perhaps in class. David Martins, the writing director here, is always talking about in-class writing assignments. To really engage with the writing process in class rather than this feedback that students may never see. Are writing assignments asking students to engage with the text? Are you just saying, write a reflection paper, how do you feel about the Cultural Revolution? Or are you really saying, here's a document about the Cultural Revolution. Here's a press release by journalists in Nanjing during the rape of Nanjing. How do you analyze this primary source? How do you engage with it? Those are kind of writing exercises that go beyond just putting words on the paper. How do we engage with our students outside of the class? I oftentimes might find myself the kind of sage on a mountaintop model. I sit in my office and I wonder, well, where are the students? Why aren't they coming around, And so are there more effective ways that we can engage with students? Can we make student engagement outside of the class mandatory in some way? Can we have that a component of the course? I don't know. I don't have the answers, but some way, because as Richard points out, faculty engagement is one of the two, along with reading and writing, one of the two factors that can significantly increase scores on this CLA exam, right? Engaging students in the academic, I know a lot of faculty at RIT do this, and they should be applauded for it. They engage students in the academic process. They have them write academic work. They have them do peer reviews. They have them present it at, for example, undergraduate conferences that we have here at RIT and also in the field. Do we do that? Do we actually show them what it is to be an academic? And finally, just a few thoughts. I know this is a kind of a text-heavy slide, but just a few thoughts on who teaches the teachers. I went to Penn, very good school. Elizabeth went to Brown, very good school. I dare say we probably had no real pedagogical training when it came to teaching. We did some TA work, and then you're thrown into the profession. And so then realizing that, it's really up to the Institute. And I think RIT does a pretty good job on this with the Innovative Learning Institute and Teaching and Learning Services. But that can be more robust. You can really target, and maybe using a student rating of teaching effectiveness system to really target where faculty need help and make these kind of resources available, and have a system of mentoring where mentors who are trained in good teaching techniques can identify problem areas and then suggest workshops, perhaps even one-on-one training on some of these areas. And then finally, a few last thoughts as I was watching the White Sox lose yet another game. I came up just with a couple ideas. And for example, they're like 27 games behind. We don't have to go there, but could you have, for example, an academy of educators? I mean, could you have, for example, a faculty from every college, 9 colleges across the Institute, with course release, with perhaps financial support, to really come together as an academy and make themselves available to young faculty, to seasoned faculty, shall we say, who really would like to learn new pedagogical techniques? I think if it was faculty doing that, it's a little less threatening than going to educational professionals, or you know, if they're peers that are doing this, it makes it a little more accessible, perhaps. Another idea is something that RIT, again, has been mulling over for a while, and now we're implementing it on a limited basis, a first-year seminar. Why not? Knowing that faculty expectations are one of the things that can really be a driver of student performance. Why not have a first-year seminar in which students from their very first semester on campus are exposed to this kind of faculty expectation, in which there's 20 pages of writing and 40 pages of reading a week. I mean, you know, you said that Richard said that students coming out of high school are shocked that the workload is different. Well, it doesn't have to be different, right? So why not expose them to that right off the bat? And faculty mentoring and peer review again. But of course, this presupposes that senior faculty are versant in and conversant in good pedagogical teaching techniques. So just a few ideas I had last night. Thank you.
So thank you for those kind comments. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Elizabeth and Michael both kind of focus on the kind of what to do piece of this, and Elizabeth said it explicitly. You know, that the work is a little bit light on kind of prescription, and I think that's partly, you know, as a social scientist, that's where I find I'm reluctant to go without evidence. And I will say that in higher ed today, we have very, very little investment in that basic R&D around, you know, research on how to do this, reach students today that are different, you know, that how to use the technology that's different. And so Americans today have $1 trillion in debt for higher education. For the next trillion, how much of that is going to go to basic R&D to figure out how to do this job better? And so the book doesn't say very much about best practices and progressive pedagogy and so on, because frankly, I'm not all that confident that there's empirical validation for all those things that I might personally like and believe in, but again, very limited, more limited empirical demonstration than I'm comfortable with. And I'll say one other thing and then open it to questions. I think we need to, you know, Michael and Elizabeth both saying kind of recommit the college and university to focus on this core mission of teaching. And I would say, I just want to put it a little bit in historic context. If we don't, and this is different than the book that finished The book was written, 4 years ago or something, a long, long time ago. And I say that, tongue-in-cheek, but 4 or 5 years ago in higher ed, it was a completely different landscape. And so when I wrote the book, I said, this isn't really good news, but everyone's getting what they want, and it's not going to change. It's not going to change very likely because everyone's satisfied. 5 years later, everyone's not satisfied. You listen to the discourse in policy circles and in the media. You look at the disruptive technologies that have emerged onto the field. There really is a pressing need to figure out how to do this piece of instruction and undergraduate quality and teaching better than we've done it in the past, because if we don't, we're really going to face significant challenges. So I'm happy to take questions.
First of all, thank you very much for bringing the subject to RIT and your outlook on this. And I'm proud to say, as a member of the Board of Trustees, that we have been engaged. We have a long way to go, but we have, I think, made a significant investment through the Office of the Provost and his staff on how do we go about measuring academic quality, and how do we assure that we have continuous improvement programs in all of our academic units, particularly in our basic studies areas, to assure that academic quality is continuously improving and our students is reflected in the outcomes of the courses that our students take. Now for the question. Many times in industries there are significant discontinuities that cause the rules of the games to change. And I think one of those discontinuities is associated with massively available online coursework. And what will that mean to residential experiences and those things which either are the pros or cons of residential experiences in light of critical thinking? And how do you deliver critical thinking skill sets and practice them and evaluate them and so on in an environment where the student may be increasingly decentralized? So I'd be interested in having you kind of look forward into the future that has massively available online learning situation and ask the question, how do we assure that we have critical thinking as part of the outcome that is necessary for a successful student and also ultimately a successful citizen?
Yeah, that's great. So I understand these changes in the following way. First of all, like any industry, you have to pay attention to the changing technologies that underlie the production that's occurring. And there's been a technological revolution that's occurred over recent decades in two areas. And it's important, we often see one, but we miss the other. And those two areas are digital education around instructional delivery. The MOOCs are one example, but not the only of that. There's a big initiative here on games, digital games, and so on. But there's another change in technology that's equally important that shouldn't be missed, and that is there's a technological revolution that's occurred around assessment. That we have technological capability now to assess student performance with adaptive testing, with large data collected on students longitudinally and combined together, analyzed systematically. And so you see a revolution in assessment driven by technology, not just in the States, but if you go look abroad. There was an OECD report in March about assessment in education in 25 countries. And you see that, once you see that it's not political, it's not No Child Left Behind, it's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's technology that's driving this revolution. That these two pieces are going to come together. the digital education, the instructional delivery, and the assessment piece that will feed back ongoing ways to improve instruction. And so I think that that because the assessment piece is going hand in hand with that, you will get the skills that matter, like critical thinking, complex reasoning, writing, in those assessments. You can assess today writing essays with computer algorithms. The CLA we used, the measure we used, was human graded, but there's computer gradings of computers that are quite reliable and valid. And so there's a technological change underfoot. Let me give you one final example of this. To think beyond just the U.S. In Columbia, the country Columbia, not the university. Right? How many people in the audience know that there's a national, for every college student that's going to graduate, there's a national day of testing where they take multiple tests that are aligned with their major. So there are multiple domains. Quantitative reasoning, a social scientist might take. They take multiple assessments, and they've got student, because they're reported to the national government there, the government also has data on student performance in high school when they were taking coursework in 11th grade. So they can do value-added assessment at the institutional level and at the program level within the institutional level, and they report those results publicly. Columbia, right? The world is changing. Technology is really creating whole new capacities for what education and instruction is going to look like. And so for a college and a university today, the last few decades, there's been a lot of investment in amenities. But if I was on the board of trustee advising, I would think about what kind of investments are going to be needed to be made in the next decade to position the institution to be able to face these real challenges.
First, I'd like to thank all three speakers. You were very provocative. You brought up some really good ideas. And I'm very glad that you brought up technology, because I am in science and technology studies. But I'd like to back up a little bit and look at less global, less large-scale technologies, simple things like pens and papers, and Word and autocorrect and spell check and those sorts of technologies that the students have access to. What I've noticed in my intro students, I teach 2 sections, is they lack basic skills. They can't write complete sentences. They cannot take notes in class. They can't even read the syllabus and pay attention to due dates and look at basic standards for what a paper is. 1-inch margins, Times New Roman, 12-point font. Doing a header in Word has been a struggle for me. And I don't need some large-scale assessment program to be able to identify that my students are relying on Word's autocorrect system in all the wrong ways. You can see all of the homophones, and I'm pretty sure all of you see these too. There, your, all of these other words that they're trying to use that they don't understand how to use, Word gives them a pass on it. They don't know how to use the basic technologies that some of us didn't go through school using. They don't know that. They don't know how to Google a grammar blog to look up how to use commas. It's all out there. It's really easy for them to use. They don't start out calling professors Professor so-and-so. They call them Miss, Ms., Mrs. I've gotten all 3. They call you by your first name. They don't have the professional survival skills to know how you start out addressing somebody in an institutional setting. So unfortunately, that is not something we didn't have to deal with that before. We're getting that from the high schools. I coached high school debate and forensics. I tutored SAT. I tutored AP science and math and all of that. And some of the students are exceptional. Some of my 16-year-old debaters could wipe the floor with some of the seniors here in terms of critical thinking skills. If I asked them to write an essay, they'd be able to churn it out easily. I get students staring at me like a deer in the headlights saying, "How do I write the essay?" 2-page essay. How do I write that? They don't know. And that's a big burden that we have. But we can't just assess and give them bad scores that they probably deserve. Because what's different about today's students is they're more likely to turn cynical. And the problem is that if we just give them the bad marks without them understanding why they're getting it, they're going to tune out and we're going to lose them. But this is the other problem with the civic engagement. The reason why these students aren't reading the news and aren't talking about politics is we've taught them so much critical media studies that they realize all of the news sources are biased, so why bother reading them? They've all got an agenda, they've all got an ideology, so why bother? And so we have this really difficult fine line we have to tread where we have to encourage them to be better, we have to help them to grow without driving them away back into some shell where they think that they can't talk to anyone, where they don't think that they can make any sort of a difference, and where they can't trust any sort of information. And so I think it's great that you've brought this up, but I think that we need to expand this question to some of the ideas that Dave brought up. You know, how can we implement some of these changes? How can we integrate with them? So it's less of a question and more of a comment.
Yeah, no, so I appreciate it. I mean, I think your account really drives home the point of the challenges you're facing around the basic skills and competencies that not only that the students are bringing into the classroom, but leaving college with. And so increasingly today, employers can't trust that a college graduate has these basic skills because they're just kind of passed through. All the emphasis is on retention. And so what's happening, employers increasingly today are relying on their own assessments before they hire people. In my own research shop, I won't hire people without giving them a performance task. And the reason is because I've hired too many people from elite institutions that don't have basic skills. And I'm tired of getting burned on this. And so I actually give them, like this, a set of documents to do where they have to write something. And large firms are doing this as well. Let me say one other thing about the assessments. We are the federal government, in case you're unaware, for the first time last year, gave permission for colleges and universities to award degrees based on competency-based performance assessments. Not seat time, not how long are you in the seats, because we see that they're not, we see the problem with that approach, but rather, what can you do? And demonstrating that you can do something is sufficient to get credit and to get a degree from. And for the first time last year, the Fed said that was okay for federal funding. And so the world is changing, and the world is changing around technology, and the world is changing around assessments being a part of that. Sir.
I guess the underlying assumption is that most of this discussion has to do with undergraduate teaching and learning. Should we also worry about graduate teaching and learning? Are there any data out there that address the problem? And the final part of the question is, should we be thinking about the kinds of critical thinking skills that are similar or different in undergrad versus grad, and what would those be?
Yeah. So we have a very small research base to really empirically address that question. I'll say, just from my knowledge of the field, two things. One, the master's level programs, I think we absolutely have that same problem, often worse, because often in many colleges and universities, the standards to get into a master's program are lower than to get into an undergraduate program. I don't think, however, these criticisms of the state of undergraduate education apply very well to PhD training, professional and PhD training. One of the reasons for this pattern we argue in the book is because faculty have been encouraged to focus on their research, not on their teaching. All the professional rewards are focusing on research and scholarship. That is very well aligned with doctoral training, with PhD training, because you can get people involved in your research and scholarship. And so I still believe we have the best PhD training system in the world. We have the best system in higher education for research and science, generally. It's not the case that I think higher education as a whole has a serious problem. But because we've focused on that, we've neglected this core element, and that's really, so I think there's some real differences that are important to acknowledge. Sir.
Me, sir, I don't have a mic, but my question is about what I would call a PE ratio. And by that I mean price to education performance ratio. And you talked earlier on one of your slides, that we go in reverse in time, and about the cost. And so I'm kind of looking at if we overlay the output of the system. Granted, there's a huge variance with respect to standard deviation of output at various, to normalize the data. Do you have some sense of the dollar spent on education versus the critical thinking output?
Well, it would be very troubling indeed. The price of college has, the increase has gone up at twice the rate of inflation since 1980. So we've had dramatic cost escalation in this sector. And like I said, it's twice what the cost is in Europe. Now that's a real, we talk about disruptive technologies, and digital education I think is the primary one. But think also, increasingly we live in a globalized world where the college that I teach at has is now called the Global Network University, and every student is expected to do study abroad. And that has all sorts of great benefits and all sorts of challenges, because depending on what the character of study abroad is, separate conversation. But there's not much of a difference between all of a sudden sending every student for junior year abroad to why not do all 4 years abroad? Why not go to England or Ireland or Canada? That's not too far from here, if I remember my geography right. And is the quality of education notably different? And again, we see hours studying are greater there. And so, I think those things are actually real threats too, that the system will face as the limits of this cost financing model kind of finally hit a wall, like we've seen happen in the last few years. Sir.
I have two questions. In your survey, you showed how many people read news in the paper or online. Did you look into how many regularly listen to in-depth news programming on the radio, for example, or on TV? Because there are, depending on what you listen to, there are good sources where you can get in-depth. And frankly, when I was still working, I did not have time to read the newspaper, but I think I was always pretty well informed because I would listen in the car or when I was eating or whenever. So that's my first question. You want to answer that first before I...
Sure. So, we also asked, where do people get your main news? And we also have something, I said there's a follow-up book coming out that's going to be discussing all this research, but something that ended up not getting into the book because my co-author made us cut it. But I'll tell you guys this. And you could, and so we asked, as a social scientist, I was really worried. We were surveying them in 2011. The spring of 2011 and interviewing them the summer 2011, and the book was released in January. And as a social scientist, I go, oh my gosh, the book got all this attention, I've contaminated my study. And so what does a good social scientist do? We put in survey items to test whether or not, in fact, they knew about the book. And so we asked them about have you read these 3 books one at a time? And if so, tell us about them. And the first was Amy Chua's Tiger Mom, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom. 25% of the students had heard about that. And then we put in our book and then a control, which was something published by Harvard University Press called The College Fear Factor, about how kids are afraid of their teachers in community college. And we put it as a control because that got no coverage, media coverage. Troubling finding. The students reported that they had heard of that one more than they had heard of our book. We were slightly below the control. 2% of the sample said they had heard about it. And then we said, well, what do you think about it? What do you think about it? And we got open-ended response. This was a typical response. Yeah, I heard something about this on Facebook, and I think there was a problem with the measure. Nothing like that, this is us, I sat for the test twice. It's a study. No awareness of it. And so, so we took that part out because, we didn't want to, people would critique us for assuming people knew about this. But the book got a lot of attention. You had to really have been asleep not to be aware of it, especially if you were part of the study in one of these colleges. You really had to not be plugged in, and they're not plugged in. It's not the fact that they're getting their media on their news on Twitter, and they're just not plugged. They're not, there's other surveys out there, other people done about kind of basic knowledge about world events, and boy, it's dismal.
My other question was, do you think the lack of emphasis on learning foreign languages, the fact that very few people learn even a second, let alone a third language well, and hardly any learn classical languages, is that a factor in the lack of critical thinking skills? Because each language has different ways of expressing similar or the same thoughts. And there's really, if you're multilingual, sometimes there are different types of thought processes going on depending what language you're speaking. And one thing that brought this home to me is just the other day I was speaking to a college student who had no idea what a genitive was, because she speaks English, and it's not obvious in English. And you learned that in first year Latin. And so is there any relationship there between the sad lack of emphasis on learning foreign languages, multiple languages, classical languages, and the lack of, or would a greater emphasis on that at least slightly enhance critical thinking skills?
Yeah, that seems completely plausible to me. Our data was kind of inadequate to test that. And I guess we could have pulled up the number of language courses and see whether it tracked with it. We didn't do that. We had a lot of interest in if you did a study abroad program, did it track with anything? There's more to be done. But that sounds like a plausible hypothesis to me. I just don't know whether it's empirically true.
And let alone the fact that then it opens up access to, if you know the language well, to literature and the different thinking that went on in the different countries and at different times.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
We've got time for one more, I think, question, and I'm going to give the microphone.
Thank you. I'm speaking as an ex-dean of liberal arts at RIT, and I hope you'll forgive me for some of the remarks. One of the real problems I see begins with point 1A on graduate education. I remember as a history major, I tried to take a course in political science, and I was warned off with no uncertain terms. You stay in history. And I tried to debate this with my major professor just once and indicated there's knowledge to be learned in other fields. And this is very useful. And he said, Paul, he said, you don't want to do that. I got the message. Second point, and I hope I will not offend too many professors here. I found over a period of time that there was a real aversion by professors to offer or to ask students to do papers in writing. It can be on a computer. I kept hearing, my, what a large number of papers I've got to take home tonight. And I said, my heart is bleeding for you. That doesn't make deans popular. Another problem I think that's important is that students come to college too often today with expectations that are social and athletic, and they are not coming with a mindset that a college is a place where you can learn to think critically, where you can move up in the world of work. So we've got problems with students, I think, with professors, and with graduate schools. I have the least hope for graduate schools. To me, it's like trying to move a well-established graveyard. But I think that some of the ideas that you've had here are very, very interesting, and hopefully more people will take them up.
Yeah, so I'm a little more hopeful about all three. So let me start with the grad school. First of all, you know, I'm a strong believer in the value of being grounded in a particular discipline. But one thing that's changed in the last decade or so is there's a real effort in many colleges and universities to bring together researchers from different disciplinary perspectives to collaborate on questions. And funding from a lot of the national foundations now promote these interdisciplinary teams doing the research. So I think some of that has changed. The writing piece, you know, faculty don't want to take home all this writing, and that's in one sense it's very understandable, but in another sense it can be addressed if faculty have pedagogical training. And let me say, if you think that a student should write for their development, you assign the writing and then you figure out a strategy for dealing with it, right? That means, you know, I'll tell you, I was a teacher, Chip said this, in Oakland, California before I went to, back to grad school. And I was a teacher of English, 5 classes a day, 32 students in a class, 160 students every day. Now, if I said, okay, I've got too many students, I'm not going to assign them writing, even though I'm the English teacher, no one would buy it. Instead, luckily I had been trained before to know you write, you have them write, you grade holistically, you do peer review when you can, you come up with strategies where you don't have to kill yourself grading. And so the faculty today, they don't know those strategies because no one ever taught them that. No one ever taught them that there's ways to assign writing for students to benefit from it without killing yourself, and the papers go in the who said that, in the recycling bin. That you know, Michael said that. I've had that experience also, where you know you grade them all there in front, and you're sitting in that box, or if you're attending to FERPA in envelopes within the box, and you just get angrier and angrier because the majority don't get picked up. But then you know, again, there's ways to think through that. And the last one was about the students. I totally agree with you that today they come to colleges and universities with a different definition of what college should be about, and much of it involves social networking, social activities, and the like. But I think it can change. I think it can change for 2 reasons. One, the world is changing. The economy is changing. We've just finished a decade, an earlier decade in the 90s, where a college degree was all it took to get a good job. The returns for a college degree were greater historically compared to a high school degree than any time in history. So it was pretty much true. All you needed was a college degree and there were economic benefits. That's no longer the case, right? From 2000 on, it started to flatten out, and it's actually, the relative benefits have decreased. It's still valuable to go to college, but increasingly students know that that's not the case, that it's all they need is a credential. And so I think that that's going to impose a rigor on them, that their orientation. Also, I just believe in young people reinventing the world and correcting things, especially in an open democratic society where we allow criticism, we allow data and findings to inform public discourse. And so I think that also allows the power for change. Thanks again for everyone's time.